welcome everyone, and thank you very much for coming. This is the second in the series of 4 of poultry webinars for smallholders and crofters, and we're delighted to have Caroline Robinson back, and she's feeling much better and is now on screen. And we're also very delighted that we've been joined by her colleague Marion McMillan, who is normally a sheep expert, but her own personal interest in poultry has got her dragged in and is very kindly giving her evenings to share her experience and knowledge with us. So I'll pass over to Caroline and Marion. Thank you both very much for coming and speaking to us tonight.
Hi everybody, really good to see you all back again this week. As Jeanette said, I am feeling much better and won't mute myself to cough and then fail to get back in, or any of the mishaps that we were seeing last week. So yeah, it's a slightly less formal format tonight, just because, as you've probably seen if you've been looking up your own information online as well, the sort of hatching and rearing process, you'll find very slightly different preferences from different books, different websites, different keepers themselves. People have quite often tried things themselves over a period of time with completely different methods or different incubators or different climates outside and things. You'll hear a little bit about how important that is. So it can be quite confusing, and what that does ultimately result in is there a little bit more of a conversation, a little bit more of a back and forth about what things have worked for people, and there's not really such a prescriptive one thing that absolutely works for everybody because there's so many variables involved. It's also worth saying that there is quite a lot of amazing information available online as well to peruse at your leisure. So in terms of if you're trying to keep up once we all get going and start chatting about various techniques and things, if you're struggling to keep up with notes and things like that, we do always try to make sure that you know where there's some really good, reliable information to be had as well, which is we're going to make sure to do tonight. If I can get these, oh, there they go. So just as an example, and some of you will have heard some of these names last week, but they weren't necessarily shared on slides last week. Just to start off to say, if you're new this week and you weren't here last week, do have a little look back if you can. You can get the link for the webinar. We also put them up, the recordings, on the FAS page. We explained last week what the Farm Advisory Service is and where to find that. We can email you out links to the recordings. But if you're new here this week, we talked last week quite extensively about bird flu, about what the requirements are on chicken keepers for bird flu, and also about the Scottish Kept Bird Register. If you're here this week, you didn't hear about that last week, do go back and have a look. You probably are eligible to need to put yourself on the Scottish Kept Bird Register, even if you think it used to be for only flocks of only 50 chickens or more. That's not the case anymore. If you do intend to keep birds, or if you keep birds, there's a really good chance you actually need to be on that register. So just go back and have a look at that information if that's the case. And also, if you weren't already aware, if you are thinking of keeping birds, you are going to be subject through poultry to the requirements of the bird flu legislation as well. So we talked about that as well. So that's some of the information that you might want to go back and look at if you hadn't come across it. We talked very briefly last week about the chickenvet.co.uk website. That has a variety of different pages on it, but one of them is a sort of chicken symptom checker, for example. It also has pages on various different conditions and a bit of chat about chicken husbandry. There's some info that you can find on the British Hen Welfare Trust website. Poultrykeeper.com is one that you might hear a little bit about tonight, just because I feel that they have a lot of free information online specifically about incubation, hatching, rearing, and so on. The one thing that I would say about that particular website before I forget is that I did notice the other day that despite having been up for, a couple of decades or something like that, quite a long time anyway, sort of 10, 15, 20 years, something like that, the guy is going to have to take it down. So if you were looking for some of the information that we've sort of suggested, there could be more of on poultrykeeper.com. it looks like that website's going to have to be taken down before May just for financial reasons. So if you were going to have a look, you would rather do that sooner rather than later. There's obviously the Poultry Club website. We talked a little about that, but I didn't have it up on a slide. As we said last week, notifiable disease is always APHA that you want to contact if you have any suspicions of that. And you can quite often access post-mortem examinations through your vets. Now, we did talk about diagnostics very briefly in layer chickens, but it's also worth saying if you had a batch of chicks and if something was going terribly wrong with them, don't just assume that because they're tiny, there's absolutely nothing that people could tell you. If you are having big problems, you might want to just have a chat about whether or not there might be something that your vet or that your local SRUC could tell you just by looking at some of the dead chicks. And of course, there's potential for your local enthusiastic chicken vet. That's a copy of a map from the Chicken Vet website there, which actually pinpoints various chicken enthusiast vets. They try and keep a wee register at the back of their site, which is quite nice. In terms of what breeds you might want to hatch or rear and what the pros and cons of those could be, again, poultrykeeper.com has a breed section about that. Rare Breeds Survival Trust gives you quite a lot of information about rarer breeds. Poultry Club website and various hen house or equipment suppliers also have information online. And of course, there's your local hen enthusiast or chicken enthusiast as well. For some of the information that we're just going to have a wee chat about around slaughter and disposal, one of the good websites that you can have a look at for that is the Humane Slaughter Association, because the thing that we always find with these webinars, and as it should be, is any time there's a little bit of extra science or a little bit of extra information comes to light, then the information does get updated, and these are some of the sites that would constantly try to keep their information up to date. The welfare information is the up-to-date guidance codes, which we sent out to those last week. And I mentioned briefly the VicVet website as well. She's got some of the some free information on various breeding on her website, so that's a copy of that there. Somebody also did last week as well ask about showing, and I'd mentioned that website from that perspective because I think she is a poultry judge and so on as well. So from a showing point of view that I really know absolutely nothing about and can't help with at all, that's an example of somewhere you could go for some information. So we'll just go through a few slides of information and then we're going to have just a little chat through some of Marian's amazing pictures because she's very kindly raided the archives just to give us some examples of some of the things that you might be able to see. And we'll just have a general chat because both Jeanette and Marian have their own experiences with different circumstances with hatching and rearing. What we want you guys to think about specifically is why you want to breed or rear your own. Whether you're breeding your own or whether you're rearing your own from eggs, you quite fancy that idea of perhaps buying in hatching eggs, or maybe you fancy the idea of buying in day-old chicks. The one thing that I see over and over and over again on social media or as vet queries is people saying, I really do want to hatch my own eggs, but I really don't want to have to deal with some of the consequences, such as cockerels. I would find that very difficult to get rid of them, or I would find that very difficult to dispatch them, or if there were some malformed chicks or something that just weren't doing, I don't really want to find myself in a position where I have to sort of deal with that. What's the best way to avoid it? And unfortunately, the answer to that is there is no way to avoid it. You're moving into an entirely different welfare sphere. We talked obviously about getting point of lay pullets, which have already got themselves almost to maturity, and then keeping them as laying hens. And that comes with its own challenges, don't get me wrong. But if you are breeding or rearing your own, you kind of end up in an all bets are off situation where you're going to take eggs or very young chicks and hope that they do manage to develop correctly and that they do manage to, as many of them being female as possible. And there are going to be circumstances either in which you have to make the decision to dispatch them or get rid of them, or the real problem that we see people sometimes running into is if they can't bring themselves to do that, they might end up with overcrowding, they might end up with real problems if too many cockerels are brought to maturity and they all start fighting. There's some horrible welfare problems that can come about by delaying the inevitable need to make a decision. So that's why we always start off with why. Why would you like to do this? Do you think that you can cope with some of the downsides of having to do it? That said, there are obviously lots of upsides. People really do enjoy it. Also, if you're breeding your own, do have a little think about cockerel management, and also have a think about whether or not you're really allowed to have them. Just because some local authority requirements, or if you're renting, sometimes some property owner requirements, might actually already state that you're not supposed to have cockerels. Or perhaps if you were rearing for meat, there might be something in those requirements to say that isn't something that's permitted on your land. So it's always worth just checking into your local situation to make sure that you're about to do something that is permitted in the area. You can have a think about whether you would like pure breed or crosses. Just because you are now going into hatching or rearing doesn't necessarily mean you have to go down the purebred route. It will give you more control if you're looking to breed your own show chickens. It will give you more control over your own personal development of your line's characteristics, whether that be egg production, whether that be meat production, temperament, whatever you like. Crosses are also quite popular as well, and certainly sometimes dual purpose breeds of chickens as well. It doesn't necessarily have to go down one particular route. You can start one way and go down a different route, find yourself going down a different route unexpectedly, or you can try for a bit more of a holistic dual purpose kind of route instead. We find that various different people start out with a rough idea of what they would like, and then things can develop as time goes on and they get more experience. Do think as well about broodies when you're breeding. If you have a particular time in mind for breeding, that might not necessarily fit with when you're going to have broody chickens. I think we talked briefly last week about how certain breeds are more likely to go broody, and that's certainly one of the reasons that some people keep bantams, for example, is because they make quite good broodies. But if you are thinking about setting eggs under a hen, you are going to have a reliable broody as well, because some chickens can go broody, and then if you move them or if you upset them, they can kind of go off the idea after a day or so, and then you've got a bunch of eggs that have started and then ended up wasting. So a lot of people tend to, certainly for sort of small numbers, once in a while, we'll think about incubation rather, and we'll talk about both this evening. But incubation does obviously give you quite a bit more control. If you are breeding, as we've said, just take your breeds into account and the behaviour. Breeder ration is a type of food. So the preparation is obviously, you are thinking about whether or not you're going to breed, if you're going to breed your own. Breeder ration is a type of food that you will need to get in beforehand, because you don't just want them on the normal ration. If you are breeding your own, you want to make sure that you've got a breeder ration, and that's really the minimum there. You will see some places recommend 6 weeks before the eggs are to be set. You'll see some places recommend 8 weeks before the eggs are to be set. But the main point is that to get good quality eggs for setting, you're going to have to make sure that your breeding stock go into a breeder ration to really improve your chances of getting good hatchability. And that's important to remember, even if you're buying in eggs instead. If you're not breeding your own, you do want to remember that that is a requirement, because if it's somebody, perhaps a friend is giving you eggs or whatever, you maybe want to ask them if they've been on breeder ration and how long for, just as a bit of a screening, to make sure that you do have good quality eggs, and these are not just sort of last minute afterthought eggs, if you like. They'll obviously be dormant until the temperature is correct. Once you've got your eggs, they won't start to incubate until you've got the temperature correct. it's one of the things that you also will have to have a think about in terms of transport. So if you are breeding, just remember that chicken sperm can be viable for a couple of weeks inside the hen. So if you're thinking about a different cockerel, or if you're thinking about narrowing down, which cockerel goes with which hens, or your timing indeed, it's not a case of you get one mate and then they lay an egg and then another mate and then they lay an egg and so on. Chickens can actually store sperm inside for up to 2 weeks. And then when the egg is ovulated, the sperm will then travel up and fertilize the egg. So one mating can last for quite a lot of time and quite a lot of different eggs. Eggs are laid kind of around about 25 hours apart. Sort of, it's not usually bang on the, although most people will know about one egg a day, it's not usually bang on the 24 hours. So it can be a bit longer, which means that you might find the eggs are being laid at different times of day. So if that's the case and you don't want your egg to start developing, you're going to have to think about collecting your eggs more frequently. A lot of people for layers just pop out in the morning, they get their eggs, and then that's them. They're not really thinking about it until the next day. If you're looking to set fertile eggs, you really want to be collecting them probably around about 3 times a day if you can manage it, just to make sure that nobody's in there sitting on them and getting them going already, because you're going to want probably to store them to get a clutch and then incubate them all together. They will ovulate again about half an hour after they've laid their egg, unless it's dark, which is why, if they are starting to set a clutch, you might wonder why there's a day off in the middle. They won't ovulate again if it's dark, and that 25 roughly hours means that every day the egg is at a slightly different time. Eventually they're probably going to hit night time, so that's why that sometimes happens. Leaving eggs in the nest will sometimes stimulate some of your hens to go broody. Some people, you'll notice, because you're collecting the eggs a lot of the time to try and set them into a sort of more even clutch, some people will say if you want your hens to go broody, use those pot eggs we talked about, or wooden eggs, I think as well. Somebody said that they had access to. You can leave them to go broody on pretend eggs. While you're sorting yourself out organization wise, and that can sometimes help as well. If you're buying in your eggs or chicks, health really starts here. I can't emphasize enough for your whole flock actually, how making sure you get the right eggs, or if you're going for day-old chicks, because somebody local is selling them, your chicks, that really can have such a knock-on impact, because there are some diseases that can actually come into your flock through eggs. So you want to start clean, and some determination might be needed here, because if you find that there's dirty eggs, or if you find that eggs are hatching, there's maybe some malformed chicks, or if you find in your batch of chicks that some of them are not really doing too well after sort of 2 or 3 days, that's when we start to hit this kind of welfare barrier that you might have to make some tough decisions to make sure that you're not left with something sickly that could really cause you big problems. So when you're buying in, you want to say, well, do we want eggs? Do we want day old? Some people buy them in a little bit older. Those are usually sort of meat chickens or something, quite often bought in a wee bit older. It just depends on what you have locally. If you get them as day old chicks, and if they're already auto-sexing breeds, then one of the advantages could be that you might have far fewer cockerels. I'm not going to say no cockerels, because most auto-sexing breeds seem to have a sort of specificity rate, a sort of accuracy rate of around about 80 to 85%. So it's not quite 100%. If you think you've got males or females, you'll find that maybe some of them are just a little bit ambiguous. But if you did buy in day-old chicks from a sexed, an auto-sexing breed, it might give you far less likelihood of cockerels and far fewer cockerels. So there is that advantage there. There's also rearing versus buying in costs as well. I don't think that anybody's really going to be saving masses of money either way. As we all know, these types of hobbies rarely end up being hugely cost efficient compared to just your box of eggs in the supermarket or anything. But obviously, that's not the full point of it. So when you're talking to somebody about eggs, you want to ask about their hygiene. You want to ask about this particular clutch of eggs, sort of what age are the eggs, how long is it that they have been laid, and how have they been cared for. So ideally, the best eggs are usually those that were laid about 1 to 7 days ago. And one of the numbers that you will see bandied about a bit is around about stored at 10 degrees C and turned at least daily. You'll find some other numbers as well. Some people have narrowed it, sort of expanded a bit further on it, that if it's in the first week, you could get away with slightly higher temperatures than 10 degrees C, so around about 15 degrees C. Some people say you can get away with that for sort of up to the first week or so. Again, I think this is one of the situations that, because it could have slight variations from breed to breed, and certainly climate to climate as well, you might have to have just a bit of trial and error. But if somebody's got a good routine, and you can tell that they've got a good routine because you've inquired about it, they're trying to be consistent, they try to make sure that they monitor the temperature, they've got it at hopefully around about 10 degrees, and they're quite open about the health of their origin flock as well, because there, as I say, there's some diseases that can pass through eggs. So if they say, oh, you know, I've had a terrible time with mycoplasma, but all the eggs seem to be fine, that's you really don't want to go down that route, because it is one of the things that can actually end up coming in via the eggs. You ask them about that breeder ration that we spoke about. They're not just dotting about on layers rations still. How much experience have they got? Do they have any breed specific issues? Because you may have heard that some breeds, especially sort of funny looking breeds, if they've got a very particular physical characteristic like Scots Dumpies, for example, you'll find that genetic issues can sometimes mean that they have less hatchability. They carry sometimes a lethal gene depending on how they've been bred. So as an experienced keeper, do they know if there's any breed-specific issues to some of the breeds that they keep? How do they find their own hatchability with their own strains of chickens as well? These are all questions that you can ask a little bit more about. Can be quite difficult, really, because I know a lot of the eggs and things are on eBay, and you know, the ability to have a bit of back and forth with a buyer can be a bit more limited. But hopefully, if you use the messaging function there and ask just a couple of questions, they'll be really forthcoming, which, you know, is obviously going to be a good sign. So we're going to see some pictures of eggs shortly. So I'm just going to explain what you're generally looking at. You start off with your yolk suspended in the albumin, which is your egg white, and that is actually the yolk is held in place by a couple of twisted ropes to either side, just so it more or less stays central, or it should be anyway, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The yolk has a little white patch on it, which is more or less the start of the chick. That's your kind of germinal disc. That's where the chicks started off. There'll be an air space at the blunt end, and you'll see that shortly. So that's one of the reasons that you'll see a lot of advice talks about storing eggs blunt end up. You want the air pocket at the top there, and you want it to be nice and firm up there, so you want to make sure that your eggs have hopefully been blunt end up for around about a day before incubating. It just helps everything to settle. It's enclosed in a shell membrane just under the shell, which is a sort of papery type substance, and then you've obviously got your nice hard shell. Now, shells, depending on the time of year, if you are breeding your own or if you are buying it in eggs, just be aware that shells can vary a little bit throughout the year. Some people feel that eggs laid in the spring might have more nutrients in them and maybe more vigorous chicks. It's really hard to say, to be honest. But one thing that does tend to happen is as summer goes on, the shell can sometimes get a bit thinner and more porous in your eggs. And you'll notice that if you have a big heat wave, actually, you can sometimes get a little rash of softer shelled eggs in really extreme cases. That is a more obvious example of, you know, the heat having a bit of an effect on the shell as it's laid as time goes on. The heat seems to affect the chickens in such a way that they do tend to sometimes produce slightly thinner shelled eggs. Newly laid eggs will have a small airspace at the top, and then what happens with that is it grows bigger and bigger as time goes on, and the moisture goes out through the porous eggshell, and that is eventually going to be your little sort of scuba tank, if you like, for the chicks. They'll get into the airspace just as they're hatching. That'll be an oxygen supply for them. So it's really, really important to them as they develop and then eventually hatch. So we're talking about candling eggs with Marian's magnificent pictures, and we'll get into more of a chat rather than just everybody having to listen to me drone on. Candling eggs you've probably heard of. It's shining a light through the eggs, looking for either development or defect. You might be able to see meat spots by candling eggs. Those are the things we talked about last week that are not particularly harmful. They're little spots of blood. You're going to be examining your eggs for viability, checking on embryo development. Why would you want to be doing this if you were just popping them in an incubator and waiting for them to hatch for 3 weeks? Well, you really want to check on them maybe about once a week just to make sure that they're not stalled and going rotten and about to explode all over your other eggs, because that would be a whole load of bacteria and a whole load of stink. So that's one of the reasons that we do check on them, is just to make sure you don't end up with that situation. Cockerel fertility and hen fertility really is always dependent on their health, their physical form, that they've had good nutrition and energy, and that they've had good sperm and sperm viability. Cockerels that molt perhaps might be a little bit less likely to be fertile. So timing of the year as well. As you've heard, that the hens tend to lay less or lay almost nothing when they're molting, but it does have an effect, or it can have an effect on cockerels as well. So what we want you to remember as well is that even if you do everything perfectly, there are outside influences that can affect the hatchability. And as time goes on and you do more and more of your own clutches as you're getting into rearing, you really want to become a bit of a detective, if you like. Try and find out when things are failing. Try and keep a record of how many are failing, which sources things came from, what times of year it was, even what the weather was or what the climate was, or if there had been anything that was not quite right with the incubating process, because all of that data that you keep for your own use, that's the sort of thing that is going to end up helping your success from year to year, as you start to find that in your particular situation and with the birds that you like to keep, what works and what doesn't. So yeah, that's one of the things to keep in mind. So, Marian, would you like to talk us through some of your egg examinations?
Yeah, so this was some photos I just took earlier this week. So the first 2 eggs on the left, that was a really nice fresh egg. And you can see these pictures, these are white eggs, which makes the candling so much easier. If you've got a dark shelled egg, then it is a much bigger struggle to get a nice picture, just because the light doesn't shine through as clearly. But you can see on these ones, the first 2, there's a nice clear air sac there, and that was an egg that was laid within the past 24 hours, as in I had picked it up the day I took the photos. So that's a nice fresh egg. The one on the right, on the other hand, was a damaged egg. You can see there's a little crack down at the bottom, and this is from a hen that she's been laying for probably the best part of a year now, and it really is time she had a little bit of a break. So she's got really quite a thin shelled egg, and there's damage to the air sac, so you can see it's just this sort of big space there, and it's not attached. Does the video work, Caroline?
Yeah, I've got them on the next slide.
Okay.
So we've got video 1. Hopefully that will work.
So this is the good egg, and you can see there that when I turn that egg, the air sac is staying exactly where it was. It's firmly attached in its pole at the blunt end of the egg there. So that's an egg that's perfectly acceptable to go in an incubator. And in this one, you can see that that air sac is completely not attached in the membrane at all anymore, and it's rotating along with the rotation of the egg. So that is an egg that's not worth putting in an incubator. And that's just not going to be a successful hatch. The other kind that you sometimes see is saddled air sacs, and that's where the air sac has got a bit bigger, and quite often when the eggs have been transported in the post, they've been bashed about a little bit, and you'll have a sac it's more or less staying at the blunt end, but there's much more mobility to it than there should be. And that is associated with a much poorer success rate on hatching.
And actually, if you do go on the poultrykeeper.com website, I noticed the other day that under one of their handling eggs pages, they've got some quite nice pictures of saddled air sacs there as well. Not as good videos as these ones, which is obviously why we've got these tonight, but they do have a range of other sort of slightly abnormal pictures there, which is great.
Can we just go to one of the questions in the Q&A?
Absolutely.
So it's sort of connected to both your talks and the eggs. So it's on the topic of cockerels. So if I got a cockerel just as a guard animal, as long as I collect eggs daily, are the eggs okay to eat or not? So I would say yes, but what do the vets on the line think?
No,
Absolutely.
completely agree. Yep.
Yep. My cockerel runs with my hens all the time, and we eat the eggs. We occasionally hatch, but the majority of the eggs we just eat. So yes, absolutely not a problem with the cockerel being with the hens.
And conversely, if we always have a flock of hens and they never have the cockerel with them, and that's absolutely fine for eggs for eating. But obviously, if you were wanting to get eggs for hatching, we would need to get them from another flock. And I suppose, though, if you were leading back to Caroline's talk, if you were using eggs for hatching, you would need to take your guard cockerel away for, was it more than 2 weeks if you were wanting to use a different breed of cockerel on your flock?
That's right, yeah, up to 2 weeks. You could end up finding yourself with a surprise baby, even if you've got a brand new cockerel in. So,
well, it's absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much.
And that's another one of yours, Marion.
Yep, so that was just the other end of that egg that I showed with the loose air sac, and you can just see how well the crack shows, and it's well worth handling the eggs for that purpose as well before you incubate them, because there's times that you'll have a really narrow crack that you just don't notice with the naked eye, and you can see how much more a crack shines up with that light going through the egg. So that's just another part of the check that I will always do before I pop them in the incubator.
And that's just a wee example of some of the pictures that you can see online, various sites. But obviously, that isn't somebody I know personally. You know, it's not an endorsement of a friend or anything like that. Again, it's just one of the sites that I quite like for the range of information that happens to be on it. So what they do have is they have a range of pictures of what you might expect after the first week, the various different sort of appearances, what you might expect if a embryo has died inside, or what you might expect as they really get on with developing. So there's a little foot down there and things like that. So yeah, it depends on what type of learner you are, but I certainly find things quite nice visually, just to keep things in my mind. So the next thing we were going to have a little chat about was incubators, and just a sort of choosing and safety slide to start off with, just because I know that there's a lot of really cheap incubators that are coming on the market, and obviously we all have global shipping sites and things now. If you are looking for an incubator, obviously you're going to want them to be reasonably priced, but if they're super cheap, I would maybe look at a little bit askance at that for the safety, because some councils have had to put out trading standards announcements about cheap incubators that have not been up to safety standards and have caused people problems. So I would have a little look around at prices. I would have a look at the brand and the manufacturer location, because some brands or manufacturers are based either here or in Western Europe. Some of them are absolutely fine but are based in other countries. You might want to have a look for the CE mark, but do have a care for that, because some people do just put it on when they haven't been CE marked at all. It's supposed to be a mark of safety. And the instructions should carry pretty good, clear warnings of any electrical safety hazards and recycling symbols and things like that. And they should have a standard UK plug if they're coming to you, or at the very least, an obviously robust conversion plug that comes in with it as well. If you're getting it with the wire or a non-standard plug that you're supposed to get your own converter for, that could be a potential bad sign. I mean, ultimately, you've got to remember what you're about to do is you're about to switch on something to the mains that you're also probably going to put water in or around. And those two things together, you really want to make sure you've got something that's going to work and that is reliable and that it's safe. Some people decide to buy a separate hatcher for hygiene, so they incubate and then they put the eggs in the hatcher for hatching. That's because if once the eggs hatch, there is a bacteria release. It'll depend on whether or not you're setting just one batch, or if you're expecting to set sort of a couple of different batches at different stages, for example. So some people have the incubation and then a separate hatcher because there are different conditions needed for each. Some people choose to just hatch inside their incubator. Whatever works for you. Just make sure if you're hatching inside your incubator that you've got one that's really easily, nicely cleaned, because there is a lot of bacteria released by that. And as we've said before as well, some people will use a hen or a bantam instead, because that isn't such a consideration. You're not responsible for the incubation yourself anymore, which takes a wee bit of timing and so on. So, Jeanette, I can't remember. Do you use an incubator, or is it a hen that you've used in the past?
We were just old-fashioned and used hens in the past.
Yeah. Do you want to have a little chat about how that goes for you and how you find it yourself?
I think you have to be very careful about the timing of the seasons, because you obviously need to make sure that the accommodation and everything is set up so that there's no drafts at the height that the chicks are, the hens sitting, just because, as you've mentioned, temperature's so important. And I think it can be picking the right broody hen is important, because there's nothing more disappointing than when they start to sit and then they go off it, kind of thing. And yeah, and I think again there's just some things about making sure, like, the number of eggs that you're putting underneath is in proportion to the size that she can easily cover with her body, kind of thing. You don't want to be, like, especially if you've got a mixture, if you've got very small bantams and very huge animals, you need to make sure that you're not giving them too much work, because they do want to rotate them, and if any get chilled, then that'll be game over.
Yeah. And if you were thinking about going for an incubator instead, as we've said, the temperature and humidity is important, and that can be quite influenced by your climate. And of course, even if you've got hens, if it's a particularly hot summer or something like that, that can also cause you a wee bit bother. You want to monitor your incubator, and you want to choose the location of it well. You don't want an incubator in a part of your house that has a massive temperature fluctuation or a massive humidity fluctuation. So you wouldn't want to have it in, right beside the bathroom or something where you get steamy showers and so on. You want it somewhere just nice and sort of consistent. A lot of the time, garden sheds and things are not going to be that consistent, because there's going to be quite a big outside fluctuation in temperature. And although your incubator is designed to try and keep the inside to a consistent temperature, not all incubators can cope with that big of a fluctuation of the temperature outside it. Some of them just will fail to do their job if there's too much of a variation. There's all sorts of guides online. So in terms of incubation periods, temperatures, humidity, the period's usually pretty consistent. As you can see, for chickens, usually about 21 days, can be a bit less for bantams. but you will see slightly different recommendations for temperature and humidity, depending on what stage you're at. You can be looking at 2 different sites or 2 different books, and they will just vary very slightly. All you can really do is to try, somewhere more or less in the middle of that. The principles of the humidity especially are that there's less at the start of the incubation and more at the latter stages. So the actual progression of what should be happening is more or less consistent across various different sites. It's just you can sometimes see that humidity percentage recommended just varies very slightly, which can confuse people. And you'll also probably have a guide inside your incubator. There's sort of automatic turning versus manual turning, and you'll also see varying advice regarding turning. One of the sites that I recommended tonight, for example, says at least twice a day if you're manual turning. Another site says at least 3 times a day. And I think that's going to have been their own personal experiences over decades. So yeah, basically you've got the idea. You are going to need to turn them if your incubator isn't already set up to turn them automatically. You are going to need to monitor your temperature and your humidity. You're going to have to change those as time goes on, and you want to make sure it's nice and consistent on the outside. So again, we've got another wee chat. Jeanette, did you ever use an incubator? Or you only really going down the sort of hen route, which is totally understandable when you've got them.
No, though I was speaking to a friend who incubated last year, and her top tip was to think, because her incubator beeped a lot, and she had it very set up very close to her bedroom, so she had quite a lot of insomnia due to the location of the incubator. So
these are the tips we're here for. This is good stuff. That's really interesting. And Marion, I know you've incubated quite a lot of clutches of eggs by now, haven't you?
Yeah, I've incubated a few. I mean, my experience started that this was my little lockdown project. We decided to get an incubator and hatch some eggs, and we've kind of kept going ever since. So in a way, my experience is relatively limited in that I've had one incubator and it seems to do the job, so I've got no intention of changing. But whether I have the best incubator, I have no idea. So this little picture is one of mine, and you can see in the bottom there, this is obviously at the hatching stage. We've taken the turning cradles out of this incubator because by nature, I admitted to myself that I was quite lazy and wasn't going to bother to do the turning myself. So I bought an incubator with the turning facilities. So it's a case of you plug it in, set it up, and you can pretty much get away with walking away and leaving it for the first 18 days, just checking and candling. It's very hands off. And then at 18 days, you take the turning cradles out, put down a slip resistant mat in the bottom because you don't want the newborn chicks slipping around everywhere, and ramp up the humidity and let them go. But I have to say, the one fault I have with my incubator is it is a bit of a nightmare to clean after hatching.
Right. So
The roof of the incubator, where the fan is, it sucks up the little bits of the feathers that come off the birds as they dry. And yeah, it's quite a challenge to clean it.
And I've got some numbers there from the chat we had the other day, because you get really quite a good hatch rate from your own birds, but you've had quite variable results from sort of post eggs and things, eh?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my incubator holds 28 eggs when it's at its maximum. And if I'm using my own eggs, I'm expecting to get a good 25, 26 successful hatches out of that. And what I generally find is if they're still going at a week, then pretty much 100% of what's fertile and growing at a week of incubation will hatch successfully. The eggs that I've bought online have been much, much less successful. I've had, 50% is a good hatch rate for these eggs, and I've had entire batches that have failed. So it is a much more temperamental process. One of the things I have faulted in the past was I had a batch of eggs that were stuck in the post for next day in really, really hot weather. And I suspect that sitting in a postal van with, well, you know how warm a van can get in the sun, I suspect these eggs got a little bit cooked before I got my hands on them. And yeah, just terrible hatch rates. And yeah, I've had issues even with my own. I had one batch that I tried to hatch in the autumn, and nothing hatched. And I'm assuming that was down to my cockerel's fertility at the time. It was probably about the time he was starting to have a molt. So I didn't really clock it when I picked up the eggs. But yeah, I just got nothing out of that hatch. So just to write it off and wait, give him a bit of time to recover and then have another go.
And because you're sort of in the very moist summers of the west of Scotland, you don't really need to put water in yours, do you, to reach the desired humidity until that sort of day 18 incubator lockdown period where you have to really ramp the humidity up?
Yeah, I find my incubator sits quite happily at that sort of 45 to 50% humidity, often without any water. And particularly when it is my own eggs that are really fresh and have got that really small air sac, you don't actually want to keep them too wet because you do need the size of the air sac to grow in preparation for the chick. So I've found that in a really damp, humid summer, I get on better without putting water in until I get to that day 18. Obviously, if you're in a much drier part of the country, or if you've, had a really dry summer, then it changes how you need to approach things.
And of course, if you can get your hatching done before the really big autumn storms come in, then you don't have so much to worry about regarding power cuts and automatic incubators as well.
Yes, because I have had that problem. I've woke up in the morning and found that the power had gone out, incubator's cold, and you're going, oh, help. So what I've done in that circumstance was get a hot water bottle, pop it under the incubator to try and get some heat coming up through, wrap the incubator in some towels, try and keep as much heat as possible, and then fingers crossed. And to be fair, I got away with it. But yeah, length of power cut is going to be very influential on how much you get away with. So I think a summer hatch is definitely less risky from that point of view.
Yeah,
we'll just stop you now for a wee second because we've got a great experience shared in the chat by Rosie about, and this is how livestock never quite sometimes follow the rule book. We had a Scots grey hen rush out of the rhododendrons with 15 chicks beginning of this month. And that was her second brood of the year. Not smart time-wise, but she's a great mum. Some went to homes, some of the chicks went to homes under lamps, and she only has 3 now, and they're beginning to perch but sleep under her wings still.
Oh,
So
that's so
thank you
nice.
so much for sharing that anecdote. That's amazing.
Yeah. Oh gosh, they can really surprise you sometimes, can't they?
And 15 is good going.
Yeah. Sneaky.
And just before we move on, we've kind of touched on it, even just with that anecdote, because obviously if you have a cockerel, you've got less control over when you might have chicks. But a question is, what are the positives and negatives of having a cockerel just as a guard animal? So, well, I'll start you off. I suppose you do need to be more careful if you've got free ranging hens that you are finding the eggs very quickly, because you don't, those eggs in theory, if they were could become chicks. So the beauty of not having a cockerel, and this is what we do at home, is that this doesn't occur. We don't have to even think about that because all our eggs are sterile, kind of thing. But Caroline, any what are the positives or negatives of a guard cockerel?
I'll defer to Marion on that one.
Yeah, I mean, most of the time we've had a cockerel. I My instinct, and this is just an anecdote and there's no science behind it, is that I think we get less hen pecking when we've got cockerels, because I think the cockerel keeps his flock in order. And so we don't get hen on hen bullying. If anybody's going to be doing the bullying, it's the cockerel that's going to be doing the bullying. And I tend to find that the hens maybe are more reliable about where you'll find them. Yeah, I've had good guard cockerels in that I've had cockerels who were really defensive of their hens, and equally I've had a cockerel who really just was out for himself and wasn't a very good guard cockerel.
I mean, certainly it does seem to not in all cases, but some cases really help when you've got predators as an issue. And actually, I was thinking when you're thinking about using not incubating with real hens, that's another thing that you've got to be careful of, that you do make sure that she's in a really nice predator tight place, so you're not risking her, because she will want to sit for as long as possible. But I suppose one of the other negatives in very small flocks is that sometimes, and I don't know how to say this delicately, it can be a bit hard on the hens if you've got not many hens to cockerels, and you sometimes see people making them wear funny jackets and that. So that would probably be the only other negative.
Yeah, you definitely don't want too many cockerels. At the moment, I've got 10 hens with 1 cockerel, which is hopefully reasonably kind in that we shouldn't get too much overmating.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all very much.
Yeah, so I think we've probably covered a lot of the talking points. I suppose one of the other things to think about is if storage and transport might be an issue, is maybe driving to fetch eggs rather than relying on the post. If there was that possibility, you have a bit more control. But also, if you are thinking about buying eggs, it's worth looking at the weather at the place of origin, as well as obviously you're going to know your own weather when it arrives. But you can find sometimes that if it's been really hot somewhere else, perhaps there is a bit more risk of soft-shelled or thinner-shelled eggs that are more likely to get damaged in the post and things, or just that they've been left in a warm place for a few hours, and that'll affect your hatchability. Some things are really not too obvious just by the appearance of the egg by itself. So once you've got the chicks out, and there's quite a nice, just as an example of the sort of welfare decisions that we've been talking about, there's quite a nice guide, or you'll probably find quite a few nice guides online as well, where people debate the sort of whether or not to help chicks out of eggs if they aren't managing to get on with it themselves. So once you've ramped up the humidity in the incubator and the chicks are starting to get themselves out of the eggs, you're really supposed to keep the lid closed, because if you take the lid open, the air's going to dry out, you're going to lose your moisture, and that's going to mean that anything that is in the process of hatching or hasn't quite hatched out yet isn't going to have sufficient humidity to be able to soften that shell membrane and manage to get itself out. They just get surrounded by a really dried out, horrible plasticky membrane. So when people are talking about sort of saving, if you like, the chicks that seem to not manage to get themselves out of the eggs, that some things to take into account are those are already weak chicks. There's something not quite right with them. So if you do help them out of their eggs, there is the possibility that you've then got a bit of a chick that is a bit weaker and might potentially have some other health problems. But also it's a bit like opening the oven, isn't it? When you're baking a cake, you have already just altered the atmosphere in the hatcher or your incubator by opening the lid to help this chick. And there's others in there that are trying to get out. You might actually end up sabotaging some of the chicks that would have been perfectly healthy as well. And it's quite a hard decision to make that. So you will see a bit of chat about it from person to person. There are guides on how to help them out of the egg and sort of how long to wait and so on. But you will see a bit of pushback about that for those reasons, is sometimes doing what seems to be the nice thing can actually end up being detrimental. It can have detrimental effects as well. So with the rearing, as Jeanette's already said, you're going to need to be prepared. If she's broody, she wants the food and water nice and close. She's going to have had suitable food, that shelter, that safety, away from crows and magpies, away from drafts, everything she needs to hatch, and then for her young chicks. You're going to have to make sure that you take a bit of care regarding access to food and water for the chicks as well, or prevention of access if it's the wrong type. Chicks can drown themselves if they get into the wrong type of drinker. If you are rearing them with the hen, the idea would be that the hen will be in with those chicks for around probably about sort of 4 to 6 weeks, and then the chicks by themselves for another 2 to 4 weeks. But you're going to be taking the chicks out. You're going to be taking the hen out, not the chicks out. So the idea is to have them in a house that originally the chicks are going to stay in, so that they don't get a wee shock. It's going to be stressful enough when you have to take the hen out or separate them from the hen. You don't want to have to put them in a whole load of stress by completely changing their environment as well. When you're artificial rearing, there's probably even more care needed. There's a few different heat sources that you'll see discussed. Some of them talk about heat lamps. Ideally, if your heat source isn't directly connected to a massively bright source of light, that's quite a good idea, just because you don't ever really want to be switching your heat on and off day to day, but you are probably going to want the control to make sure you can switch your light on and off, because the chicks are going to need some dark just to sleep, to settle down, to keep their daily rhythms. It tends to mean that they grow better, tends to mean that their feathers are better. Again, you'll see a couple of different recommended ranges for what the temperature level should be at the sort of floor level under your lamp or your brooder. You get these electric hens now, don't you? Which are sort of panel heaters, and they're kind of structured with extendable legs, so that as the chicks get bigger, you can bring your panel heater further and further up, and they all huddle under that. Although that's really for sort of quite often for smaller batches of chicks, just because there's only so much space under one of the electric hen brooders, whereas sometimes heat lamps can give you a bit more space for more chicks, if that's what you're planning on. So yeah, some places will say around about sort of 38, 39 at floor level. I've seen some people go down to sort of more 35, 36 at floor level. Again, I suspect it's probably going to be different lines, different breeds, different environments, whether your shed's super draft free or whether there's a little bit of air movement, that kind of thing. But that's kind of what you're aiming for. The other thing really to say as well about chicks is that you really do need to make sure that you've got a good floor surface for them, especially in the first little while. It's something that is going to be quite dry. It's going to give them a good grip, otherwise their feet don't develop properly. But it's something that they can't catch their feet on. And Marianne, I think you've got quite a good tip as to what you use on your...
Yeah, I ended up, when I had my kids, I acquired some cloth nappies, but they weren't the shaped nappies. They were big, flat, sort of cotton pads, but not the terry toweling ones. They're quite smooth. Ended up not using them on the kids because I found them far too cumbersome. And I found they're really, really useful to sit in the bottom of my brooder. And it's something that it's really easy to just roll them up when I want to change the base, roll them up, lift one out, roll another one down, and that gives them a nice fresh bed and takes all the filth away from them. My setup has an electric hen, so it's one of these little panel heaters. And what I do initially is as well as having a little mushroom drinker so they can't get in and drown, and the feeders, I also scatter chick crumb under the electric hen as well, so that wherever the chicks try and peck, they're going to get food. Just the whole base of the brooder is just scattered with crumbs for the first few days, and generally that means that all the chicks do find the food quite quickly.
And it's something that you'll see as well is one of the reasons why it's not usually a good idea to have them on shavings and things, is that you'll find that because they do peck a lot at just about anything when they're that age, if they're on sawdust, they can sometimes end up filling their little stomachs with sawdust by accident. So that's another reason that sort of cloth base is quite a good idea that we've seen. Eventually, as they go on to different foods, they will need a chick grit, but that's obviously not something that you need right from the very start. That's usually a few weeks in when they're off the chick crumb. But they do like contrasts as well. So if you've got quite a light coloured background and you've scattered the dark food on it, chicks are kind of hardwired to pick specifically at colour contrasts. So you don't want whatever it is that you've used to be exactly the same colour as your chick crumbs, for example. You want them to have a nice, really obvious visual contrast. And you can kind of poke with your finger as well. That's what the hen does. They kind of peck at things to show the chicks that they should maybe think about pecking at things. So if you've got kind of a couple of wee stupid ones that are struggling to get started, that can sometimes, if you're moving the chick crumbs around, it can help get their interest up. And once they are hatched and they're all fluffed up in your hatcher and everybody's managed to get out of their eggs if they're going to, and they've all managed to dry out, the first thing that you can do when you move them over is just have a little bowl of or a little saucer of tepid water, or that chick safe drinker. Make sure it's tepid water, and you can just give their beaks a wee individual dip just as you put them down, so that firstly they get like just a tiny taste of the water, and it will help a little bit with dehydration, but also at the same time it gives them that association between the thing that you're getting them to drink out of, or at least the water itself, and that sensation of, right, okay, that's water, that seems to be quite nice, that seems to be quite good. You don't want to have them in really cold water, just because when they've just flopped up and hatched, and before they've started eating and running around and things, if the water's too cold and you've just taken it out of a cold tap or something, you can give them a wee bit of a shock. It's not good for them. So. And then if you're rearing after an incubator, it's a really good idea to have just a nice, consistent system. So you, as we say, incubate them, you have them, there's from that little table earlier on, you have them at the right temperature, you have them at the right humidity until day 18. You're going to increase the humidity. They're going to hatch. You don't want to be opening and fiddling with the incubator for that last 3 days, and then you're moving them all after they've hatched to the brooder once they've fluffed up nicely. And I think you said you have a repurposed hamster cage, which is a lovely cleanable and environmentally friendly reuse of something as well, Marion. Is that right?
Yeah, we acquired a second-hand. It was a hamster cage originally. Yeah, and it works really well for up to about 12 chicks. Any more than that, and it's a bit tight for space, but we only keep them in there until we're happy that they're eating, drinking, wandering around, and everybody's well and happy.
And then that's sort of a small kind of 60 centimeter thing, and then they're onto a sort of repurposed larger rabbit / guinea pig sized house. Is that right?
Yeah, this was one that we ended up with quite a large clutch at one point and realised that our original version was just a bit too small. So we acquired this big plastic indoor rabbit guinea pig hutch. So it's not one of these wooden ones. I do have one of them outside as well that sometimes the chicks go in when they're older. But I find that the nice plastic base is really good because it's really easy to clean, and it means that I shouldn't have problems with things like coccidiosis building up with my chicks, because each batch is completely cleaned and disinfected before I would introduce any new chicks. So it helps me keep disease at bay.
Great, yeah. And if you're moving them from house to house as well, folks, just try and remember that with different temperatures, they might have different reactions. You're going to try and make sure that as you're moving them from place to place, or as you're gradually reducing the temperature as they get older, because you're either going to end up raising the heat lamp gradually as the chicks get older and better feathered, or you're going to reduce the temperature of your heat source as they get older and better feathered. But as you're moving them then to perhaps larger houses and so on, it's a wee bit of a shock to them. Sometimes it's a big temperature change on a less gradual level. You want to make sure that you're providing sufficient draft proofing and sufficient warmth as time goes on to prevent a whole load of huddling. You don't want your chicks hiding in corners and panting, because then obviously you're producing a bit too much heat. But at the same time, you don't want them all huddled together and standing on each other and trying to keep warm and just being really cold stressed, because that can really affect your chicks as well. So the way that they are reacting to your setup is just as important as any of the numbers that you see in various different either instruction books for heat lamps, or online and various sources for various people's setups and things. The behaviour of the chicks is really important, as much as anything you're going to see or read. And then as they gradually get their feathers, they eventually become able to regulate their own temperatures, and at that point you can really start to think about outbuildings and outdoor housings and so on. But that will of course depend on the time of year and also the breed of chicken you have, because some of them really are quite hardy and some of them are a little bit more delicate. So we've got a few more pictures now as well, some of Marian's lovely pictures, just talking about sexing chicks. As we've said, it can be around about 80% accurate, even for those sort of really publicised colour sex breeds. As you said the other day, Marian, if you do have ambiguous ones and you can't decide whether it's a cockerel to get rid of or a female to keep early on, perhaps that very ambiguity is a reason maybe for getting rid of them, because you don't necessarily want to breed more of the ambiguous ones. You kind of want to stick with
if you want
ones.
If you want to keep your breeds nice and strict with the sexing, then yes, it's maybe a good idea not to keep the ambiguous ones. I've never been quite so harsh. I tend to, if there's an ambiguous one, I'll give it a little bit longer until I'm sure about what sex it is. So yeah, it depends on whether you want to be very careful about keeping the genetics good and clean. But yeah, we're keeping them more for their egg laying abilities, so we're probably not quite as strict.
Yeah, it's just a bit more funny.
Yeah.
And for some of them as well, if you're prepared to wait for a few weeks and they're not auto-sexing breeds, there are sometimes differences in the feathers on the backs as the proper feathers start to come in. So a lot of breeds, as the feathers start to fill in on the backs of their necks and between their shoulder blades, you might find that they're pointed ones in males, and rounded ones in the females. That's obviously a bit later on for the proper feathering. That's around about sort of 10 to 12 weeks. There is a wee bit of a difference around about the first 3 weeks, but I think that that's far more ambiguous. And I'm not sure how obvious that would be for most people, myself included. And that is that some people say that when the feathers very first start to come in, that the tails and wings tend to come a bit faster in females. You'll see that in a couple of different places. I'm not sure how reliable that would be, because there is individual variation between chickens as well, and then there's going to be a bit of variation between lines. So I thought I'd mention that just to let you know that that is something that that people will talk about. But the second point, that the pointed feathers on the backs versus the rounded feathers on the backs, that's a little bit more reliable, but it is obviously quite a long way in. It's quite a few weeks, a few months in. So. And we've got some pictures of your lovely chicks there, Marian.
Yeah, so these are some of mine. These are all crested cream leg bars. So we've got the two on the left there are very clear females, because in this particular breed, the females have quite a dark strip down their back. And they look like they've got eyeliner, so they've got this really pretty black stripe at the sides of their eyes. The males have a more distinct white spot on the tops of their heads, so the two that are more in the corner have got this quite distinctive white spot on the top of their head, and you can see they're just generally a lot paler than the two females. And then the one at the front is one of the more ambiguous ones. I think that is a female, but I would need to have a look at a different angle to be sure about that one. So you can see there is quite a distinct difference in this particular breed. So it does make life a little bit easier in terms of, as soon as you're getting the birds out the hatcher, you can make some decisions about how many females do you have, and are you keeping cockerels or are you not putting the cockerels into the brooder? And sometimes that is the quickest and best decision, that if you know you're not going to keep cockerels, then the sooner that you call them out of the equation is sometimes the best thing to do.
And here we've got some more of yours.
Yep, so that little one has run off in the toy room, so that's a little female on the left there. And then the picture on the right is my brooder, so that you can see these cloth nappies in the bottom, and you can see how much crumb is just scattered around there. And this is them just at the stage of trying to figure out where the feeder is. And the green little disc there is just the side of the drinker, and that narrow gap is really all that they've got access to in terms of the water. So hopefully nothing should be able to drown in that. It has to be quite determined to do its self-damage in there.
That's grand. And just what we're talking about there in terms of feed is proper chick crumbs. Really good quality chick crumbs are definitely what you want to be looking at. If you're interested, that those are usually around about 20 to 22% protein, which if you've kind of looked at the labels of things like grower ration and layers ration, you'll see that there's really quite a big difference in compared to the other feeds. The one thing that we were talking about the other day as well is that you kind of expect that chick crumbs are not going to have any added drugs or anything in there, but I think you had an experience, Marion, where there was some local mix just had a bit of coccidiostat in it, which wasn't super obvious to start with, was it?
Yes, I had just requested, it was the grower pellet that I noticed it in. I had just requested a bag of grower pellet, and I was probably halfway through the bag when I realised that this was actually a medicated feed, which was, I hadn't asked for medicated feed. That was just what I was sent, which wasn't what I'd expected.
So if that's something that is important to you, and I know that a lot of places are trying to reduce the amounts of medications and things that they deal with, it's always worth just double checking labels to make sure that there's nothing in there that isn't particularly obvious. Chick crumbs, of course, are fed at will. You try and get them to eat as much of that as you can. You also try to avoid contamination, so there's a fair bit of cleaning out and things, just making sure that there's not an accumulation of poo in the places that you're feeding them as well. The growers pellets that we're talking about are usually around about sort of the 6-week mark, roughly. Sometimes depending on breed, a little bit earlier. Some very, very slow growing ones might be a little bit later. But the important thing about the growers pellets from chick feed is to remember that if you're going to be changing them over, you're going to want to do that gradually. You're going to want to make sure that maybe about week 5 they've got access to growers pellets, but they still have access to chick crumbs. And then as time goes on, they're maybe eating a wee bit more growers pellets, and then you can eventually take out the chick crumbs after a week or so, and that just gives them that transition there. The layers rations and things are way, way further on in the distance, so you know that's not something to worry about at the moment. So it really is all about transitions. As we've said, if you're sorry.
I think it maybe be a good time to ask some of the questions. It's about maybe more of a behaviour on the transitions. Will adult hens and cockerels attack/eat chicks?
I think there is a risk if you've got ones that you've reared under with an incubator. I'm always quite careful about how I introduce those birds into the main flock, and I tend to wait till they are pretty much point of lay pullets before I introduce them. If they're with a broody, it's a very different situation because the broody is going to defend them with their life, and if any other hen or cockerel comes near them in the flock, then your broody hen is going to sort that out for you.
And as well, it's not just chickens you need to watch out for. You know, if you do have any, especially crows, magpies, any predators or anything, they will try to pick very younger chicks. The broody hen, if you've got them with a hen, is obviously going to defend them from that. But if you are looking at introducing them outside when they're reasonably young during nice days, for example, and they don't have a broody hen with them, you are looking at quite vulnerable wee things, you know.
Yeah, I would definitely say if you're wanting to do that, you really, and it maybe fits in with what we're talking about, measures for any housing orders, but you would really want a tall thing that was fully enclosed with mesh on the roof so that you weren't having any aerial attacks to your wee chicks, because you've done a lot of work to get there, so you wouldn't want to lose them at that stage. And then I'll pass this veterinary question on because I must confess I'm not sure we do this very well on my own croft at all. When you bring in new hens, how long to quarantine?
I mean, ideally, if you were going to quarantine new stock, you would kind of hope perhaps about a month or so. But I know that not everybody has the space. So ultimately, whenever we do these things, there's the ideal world answer, and then there's like the real world answer. So ideally, if you could keep them separate for about a month or so, that would be really good. But if you don't have that kind of space and time, or it just doesn't suit your setup, you just try it for as long as you can, because anything's better than nothing. So for example, there are some things that will only really show up a fair bit down the line, unfortunately, and you're just not going to be able to avoid that. If, for example, you've brought in something that has succumbed to Marek's disease, it can sometimes take weeks and weeks before they show it. If you have brought in something that, for example, has come from somewhere that is pretty rife with mycoplasma, the stress actually makes them more likely to develop the signs. So you would probably expect to see that within a few days, maybe a week or so, of them being, having the change of environment and the stress. So there are some things that are more likely to show up earlier on, simply because that poor wee chicken has been stressed. It's been taken from one place and it's ended up in another place. It also depends on what your hens are like pecking order wise as well, because there's different types of quarantine. I mean, ideally you would want to keep them really separate for at least a period of time to start with, just in case they have something that is really easily transmissible. But eventually you're going to want to have them, if you can, in an area that is sort of separate from the rest of yours, so that they don't immediately get bullied by everybody, but within sight. And that's why people usually buy in more than one as well, because one chicken alone that's coming into a group, that can really be a big trouble. If you've got a little clutch of 3, that you give a little bit of time for everybody to get used to the sight of them, and then you put them in, the little clutch of 3 probably will still get bullied, but they are more likely to be able to defend themselves, and at least they're not all on their own, and they can all go off and hide together and things like that. It can really make a big difference as well. So yeah, it's quarantine facilities are not going to keep you safe from absolutely everything. You are going to really need to sort of be quite savvy about what you buy in anyway. But if you can, and for example, people that take to shows and things, quite often, there's their own chicken, and there's a measurable amount of biosecurity there, but they will still sometimes keep them separate for a week after they come back, just as a sort of mini quarantine, because although there is a bit less of risk there, there is still a bit of a risk there. So you'll sometimes see that advised as well.
Thank you very much.
And yeah, so we were just finishing off by talking about transitions. And as we've said before, when you are weaning them off the bulb or the electric hen, you're either turning the temperature down just by a couple of degrees every sort of few days or so, or you're raising the lamp a little bit every few days or so, as they gradually start to get their own feathers and start to get larger as well, because they produce their own body heat too. You're kind of looking to wean them off maybe around about 6 weeks-ish. Again, it's going to depend on the feathers, it's going to depend on the breed. But weaning can mean perhaps maybe if it's nice warm summer, obviously turning it off during the day and then on again at night is another way that you can help with the weaning. That is really going to depend on what the weather's like outside, but just no harsh transitions. And make sure that if they are going into new conditions, like if you've got a hut outside or something like that, and you've had them in a fairly light place to start with, but your hut's maybe quite a bit dimmer, that they don't suddenly go into a massive transition of light as well. That's something that people sometimes forget. Some people also just need to round off the corners with a bit of cardboard to stop them all piling into one corner just to sleep on top of each other. So depending on the shape of the place that they're going at each stage, you might find that there's certain areas that they all like to pile into because that's their favourite shady spot or whatever, that you might just need to block off to start with to make sure that everybody doesn't suffocate. So we've got some more of Marian's pictures as well, just to give you an idea of some of their eating.
Yeah, so these birds, they're probably getting closer to coming off heat. Again, we've got a mixture of the bird at the front is a little cockerel, and the 3 at the back are hens. And the yellow structure is just my little electric hen. And by this point, they're probably spending more time sitting on top of the electric hen than they are sitting under it. And that's usually quite a good hint that it's time that, you know, the electric hen can come out, because they just stop using it. And as long as they've got plenty of space elsewhere, they can make the decision if they feel they need it. If it's a cold night, they can pop under it. If they don't need it, they'll go away, hide somewhere else. And yeah, they just suit themselves. And obviously by that stage, I've moved them onto shavings, because they're big enough, they know what's shavings and they know what's food by now. They know where the food is. And in this picture, I've moved them out into this is a different rabbit hutch. This is my outside wooden hutch. So they're just getting ready to move on to the next stage here.
And then we've got some more.
Yeah, so this is in the same location, but you can see they're a little bit bigger again. A real concoction of breeds in there. And you can see that the one in the corner there is just sitting on top of the electric hen going, yeah, don't need the heat. I'm just enjoying being up high. And they've got access there. They've got the ad lib feeders. They've got drinkers. And they're just dotting about doing their own thing. And as you can imagine, when they start to use the feeders as perch, then they get quite dirty quite quickly.
Yeah, they like to climb on things, and they're starting to get their cool, punky cream leg bar hairstyles there as well, which is
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, when we're talking about housing and ground, just to kind of finish off, really, you know, you're going to want to think about, as you are moving them towards the outside, what setup you're going to have there. Is it going to be sort of like an ark that's movable, or is it going to involve having a fairly cleanable run area? Because some of the things that you have to worry about with young chickens is you are going to want fairly cleanable areas, just because otherwise you'll get a build-up of coccidia, which is an intestinal parasite of young chickens, or worms and things. So young birds are very susceptible to illness. You don't want a build-up of infection from batch to batch to batch. So when you are thinking about starting to move them into a more outdoor, less easily controllable environment, you want to think, you know, is it going to be a movable setup, or is it going to be quite a cleanable setup? You obviously need sufficient space to grow whilst contained. Do keep an eye on the ones that aren't developing properly. Again, you still want a good grip on the surface. If you've got perches in there, make sure they're not too narrow. We talked last week about sort of a couple of inches being the ideal perch with rounded corners. They've got to have shelter, sufficient shelter regardless of the weather, and you just want to keep a wee eye on their behaviour, really. And as they are getting older, oh, I've the wrong button. As they are getting older, again, any further dietary transitions are going to have to be gradual over around about a week or so. We talked about a higher proportion, higher protein grower's ration from around about the 6 to 8 week stage. And you just need to make sure, this is so important, because you might not have a lot of the same chickens coming through at the same time. Try not to keep your breeder feed or your grower feed or any of those special feeds that aren't just your bog standard day-to-day feed. Don't keep them for too long. The vitamins and minerals in them do deteriorate. So you want to keep an eye on your storage time. It's so easy to just keep something for, you know, 4 or 5 months or whatever and go, oh, we've got some of that left. It smells all right. It's not wet. It's fine. It can actually sometimes be less nutritious. And as we said about the grit earlier as well, they obviously don't need it when they're little baby chicks, but you are going to have to go for some increasing sizes of grit as they get a wee bit older, sometimes from around about kind of 4 weeks old, 5 weeks old, 6 weeks old, that kind of thing, depending on what you're feeding them. You are going to have to think about chick grit and then slightly larger size of grit as they get older. And then eventually the grit that you're going to want to look at when they're much older, they're going to point of lay, is going to change into something that has a lot of calcium in it, like your oyster shell or your limestone. And if your point of layer pullets is that sort of 18-week mark, you're also obviously going to eventually have to transition them to layers feed at the point of lay. But just be aware of the breed when that might be. So, you know, you kind of got a lot to look forward to. we've got a few of your adult chicken pictures there, Marion. That's some of your cream
Yep.
leg bars, and yeah,
They're absolute beauties.
and they're lovely.
Yeah, I do like the cream leg bars. So we've got, yep, a few cream leg bars, and there's some crosses in there, and then a silver lace Wyandotte as well, which are beautiful birds, but we found that they don't produce that many eggs compared to the other ones. So
Yeah.
yeah, we do like
And
a
have
pretty.
you noticed a hatchability difference between the Wyandottes and any of the others, or have you not tried to hatch any
Yes,
of them yet?
I've found the Wyandottes have a poorer hatch rate. Um, whether that is down to our cockerel versus the fertility of the cream leg bars, I don't know, but certainly out of the ones I've hatched, I definitely have had a poorer success rate out of my Wyandottes and far more cockerels. I have an amazing
And
ability to hatch cockerels with them.
well, we've got a question about cockerels actually, so I'll interrupt you there. I think we touched a wee bit on this, but is basically, is there a law / guidance re cockerels being noisy and annoying neighbours? My Highland thing would be, if you do have neighbours before you get any kind of hens, it's maybe quite good to speak to them, and also if you are having hens that are laying eggs, you can give them some of the proceeds from the hens from any annoyance, because even if you have no cockerels, sometimes your hens might escape into your neighbours' gardens and things like that. So they're always good to keep friendly relations. But any specific advice on cockerels and rules, Caroline or
Yeah,
Marion?
just sort of harking back to what we mentioned briefly earlier, you can find that some council areas actually have regulations about it, and you can, if you don't own your own property, you can sometimes find that there's something definitely written into any rental agreement or similar. So yeah, there can be. I mean, it's not a blanket law right across the country, and it can vary from place to place for sure. But you can find that there is something there that will, suggest or require that somebody takes action if you get a cockerel and it happens to be making itself a nuisance, I'm afraid. So yeah, I would give your council a ring if you own your own property, or if you're rented from them, or just check your landlord specifications and rules if you're renting from anybody else. And that's really, because there's not a blanket one right across the country, that's probably the best place really to find out.
Great. And another two quick fire ones. Can we give away eggs to neighbours or not? I clearly do, but is there any rules why not?
I don't think there is for giving away eggs, is there?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
I think the only thing is that at the moment in England and Wales, the housing order
Does
impacts you.
specify. Yeah.
That's one of the things that it specifies is if you sell or give away eggs, then the housing regulations apply in England and Wales.
Which is still the same position that we were in last week as well. I know that we'd said obviously last week that it could change to include Scotland. We just don't know. And there was that one case in Lanark that we talked about last week as well. We don't currently have the housing order up here yet. That's still the case. But yes, certainly the wording does actually specify not just selling eggs, but selling or giving away eggs specifically. So.
Great. And another question is, and I'll be honest and say I would say no for myself personally, but I have no scientific basis to base this on, is do you recommend baking and feeding back pulverized eggshells with feed?
I don't really, for a variety of reasons, but it's not going to save you that much money, and your oyster shell or your limestone or whatever is going to do the same job, possibly more efficiently. Do you do it anyway, Marion? What about you?
I don't know. Again, it's more effort. The fact that you do need to cook the shell well enough to make sure that you're not risking infection going back round to them. So yeah, I just give them oyster shell. But
I
yeah,
just don't want them recognizing that a piece of shell might be peckable.
yes, they certainly have to be well enough
I-
pulverized. It's not
yeah.
identifiable as shell.
Yeah, we don't want them to start any bad habits like we discussed last week. um,
Bad habits
and
are so hard to get rid of,
yeah,
I think if there's any way to just stop them developing in the first place, it would be, yeah, that would be perfect.
now this question would be more for Marion. Other than eBay or Facebook, any recommendations for where to obtain hatching eggs?
I guess word of mouth is possibly your best friend, because you're far more likely to get somebody that you can find out far more about by that method. So yeah, there's always a difficulty of it's sometimes a little bit potluck what you can get. But yeah, the more research you can do about the source of your eggs, the better chance you've got.
And if it's always worth just discussing locally, because if there is somebody who likes rearing their own chickens for eating, then that might be a source that you could, if you're hatching cockerels that you don't want to eat, then that might be a source. So there could be some cross exchanges in the local area. Well, thank you all very much for coming to the webinar tonight, and I'd really like to thank our speakers, Marion and Caroline, and thank you so much for responding on the chat as well. So we'll get a webinar 3 advertised, and we'll get that tweaked to meet your needs. And like I say, do fill in the evaluation form, and if there's any queries at all, just come back to us, and we'll look forward to seeing you after the festive period. Thank you all very much for coming along tonight.